I've just been reading this, Harry, just recently, that usually when they talk about bio, they also talk about chemical warfare. It's usually talked about in the same voice, or in the same phrase, or in the same use of the words. They're related, so closely related to each other, bio and chemical warfare. And I didn't know that. So experimenting with LSD and dosing people and making them jump out of windows and downtown Manhattan, or giving them anthrax.
Which is a little bit.
Yeah, it's right. They were both trying to yeah, and it was all about weaponizing. They say, actually, just not to spend too much time on it, but, you know, when the guy jumped out of the building, they didn't really push him. Everybody assumes, oh, these CIA guys want to kill him. They didn't have to give him a push. They left the window open. And they put him on the 20th floor and left the window open.
The claim that people jump out of windows when they do that, I've done one of those.
Right.
And I've never.
Right, a desire to jump out the window. I have to admit. I don't know where that comes from, actually. But I guess the guy had other problems because he was involved, and this is the bioweapon part. Allegedly, he was involved in Olson, right? His name is Frank Olson, right? He was involved in making germ warfare, biological warfare agents in Korea. And when he took LSD, you know, LSD tends to make people more liberal. Like, I think they did a test and they made people about 10 to 20% more liberal than
Because once you do LSD, you don't have any need for these.
Right. And he became like so guilty over it that he wanted to, he kept saying to the CIA guys, you gotta tell everybody that they were using germ warfare in Korea. That's a terrible thing, right? And that's why they wanted to get rid of it.
All right. Well, let's jump into this one.
Well, it's germ warfare, right?
The last time I was here, we spoke about the Rockefeller. The Rockefeller plan was, and I was somebody else. And this Rockefeller plan, and the name of the plan, in case anyone wants to look it up, it's called the Rockefeller Foundation, called Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development. Right? Sounding name, but it spoke about how we can instill martial law by just protecting the people with a pandemic, and then we can protect them to protect them. And that's what's going on today. And the one thing we have to discuss here is that this, if you try to get a handle on the U.S. bioweapons research, because, you know, any kind of development of bioweapons is against the international
Law.
Prohibited. Yeah, it's
Which the U.S. has signed on to.
So what they do is they say, okay, we're not developing bioweapons. What we're doing is we're creating them so that we can.
Well, the research reactors, you have a lot of that kind of stuff going on.
You know what though? But research, if you look at some of the research that they're doing, here's one. Because you know when I see they do this attack. Well, first of all, let me complete the first thought. That there's a vast network, and when you try to actually get a handle on it, try to get to see how much money is in it. It's all kind of universities. It's hundreds of billions of dollars, and it's everywhere. Every branch of the military has it. Every DARPA is in control. They have
What's
all
DARPA? Tell people.
Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, and then they have all these acronyms called like the Cooperative Bioengagement Program and Bioengagement. So
What's
like,
bioengagement?
Well, bioengagement, bioterror. It's as if you were to do a double curb stop, somebody's face into the slit. You'd say, "I'm going to engage your face." You know, it's another nice way of saying.
Why is the United States so evil? Haven't you benefited? We've all benefited from this
I'm
wonderful
not
country.
saying you can't say the United States is a small cadre, and I'm saying that not all these people that are in this vast bio research would be interested in doing bioengineering stuff. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying that it's done through compartmentalization. So, for example, you go to Madison, Wisconsin, and they're developing a biological agent that's extremely human transmissible. It's airborne transmissible, and it's highly pathogenic to humans.
That's that's where I went to college.
Okay.
I have my master's
Why-
degree at the University of
why
Wisconsin.
the
But
fuck?
I have the sniffles.
Okay.
Uh-oh.
Why the hell would you want to develop something like that? And they say, well,
They the primate. Famous for their primate.
they
Most
do.
famous primate.
okay. So then I say, okay, so then this kind of stuff is happening all throughout the United States. And the other thing you have to know is that there are a series of countries that are the partners in this cooperation. And the biggest one is, and when you look at the nations that are involved, there's a map of all throughout the, I'll just read it off to you for you. Some of the biggest ones, one of the biggest ones is in Georgia. Not to be confused with the United States. Georgia, we're talking about Georgia, on the border of Russia. Georgia is known as being one of the most nations. More than Ukraine, Georgia. Georgia, if you want to go to medical school, you just pay them $30,000 and you can take so, and if you want to get anything done, you want to get it's all much cheaper. But if you look at this, it's all the most corrupt nations on earth which have these violators. So you've got like Sierra Leone. They burn fires in their head. You have Liberia. Liberia, they have it's the worst nation. Why do we do this?
What are we doing exactly?
We're doing bio research. But
And who's doing this bio research? Who's in charge of it?
the people who are in charge of it, the name of the program is the Cooperative Biological Engagement Program of the Defense Threat Reduction. Again, not reduction.
So it's Department of Defense. This is coming out of the
Yeah,
Department
it's
of
a DARPA, though, is the guy who's the main one.
So DARPA is the
5G fifth generation technology promises faster download speeds and conveniences that most of us have never dreamed of, but will also be blanketed with a new type of radiation called millimetre waves. Health experts are warning about the rising risks with a 5G rollout.
It's not been made clear to the public that 5G won't just be another number and light up on your cell phone. It requires an entirely new infrastructure of thousands of small cellular antennas to be erected throughout cities where it's going to be installed.
What would 5G infrastructure look like? Small cell antennas could be placed as close as every third hydro pole. Scientists from 42 countries are now warning their governments about the emerging health problems associated with wireless radiation, and Canadian doctors and scientists have added their voices.
The most prevalent symptoms include headache, fatigue, decreased ability to concentrate, tinnitus, irritability, and insomnia. Impacts on the heart and the nervous system are also of great concern.
Dr. Rena Bray has been working at the Provincial Environmental Health Clinic for 15 years and seen the number of people suffering adverse effects from electromagnetic exposure rising.
We are concerned that the upcoming introduction of 5G will significantly increase the proximity and extent of exposure to microwave radiation in Ontarians. We predict that the number of people who develop the symptoms I just mentioned will rise in the places where 5G is first installed.
Dr. Magda Havas is internationally recognized for her research on the biological effects of electromagnetic pollution. She said that at high intensities, these waves cause intense heat and pain because sweat glands on the surface of our skin act like mini antennas.
At lower frequencies, scientists are predicting damage to eyes, loss of insect populations which are already declining, antibiotic resistance in bacteria, and physiological effects on the nervous system and on the immune system.
Radiation from radio frequencies is classed in the same category of carcinogens as lead. One advisor to the World Health Organization said there's enough evidence that if they were to re-evaluate radio frequency radiation,
it would be placed in class 1, i.e. a human carcinogen, and governments could not possibly ignore that.
Some say the scientific debate about the health effects of microwave radiation is over, but the question remains, can we afford to take this risk? Medical doctors are requesting delayed deployment until testing can be conducted on the long-term biological effects of 5G technology.
Hello, everyone. This is part 4 on the video series that I started putting out about 5 days ago, which is COVID-19 conspiracy question mark. The last video, part 3, talked about the actual research regarding COVID-19 and its relationship to the wild type coronavirus, specifically the SHC014 wild type strain, and what was done to make it into a chimera, and the research that was actually published. Some people that have tried to attack me on it, which obviously they did not even bother looking at the video because I actually showed the studies, but the vast majority of the people that have a critical mind, that are intelligent people, were able to see with their own eyes. Again, they didn't refute what their own senses showed them, what their own eyes showed them. Now, this part 4 is looking at the role of 5G in the immune system, and if there is a correlation, how does it correlate the 5G to the coronavirus, to the COVID-19 breakout? And there have been some people that have talked about this already, but it was never given with any fact. It was the conspiracy theorist type stance, and I really wasn't sure whether to believe it or not, so I decided to look into it myself. So first I'm going to present the relationship between 5G and the immune system, which essentially, I'm just going to make a statement right now that I'm going on to prove it, but essentially 5G rapes the immune system. All right, I'm just going to say it. No offense intended. The point being that it is that harsh and it is that dramatic and it's that damaging. The second component was I wanted to see whether there was a correlation between the rollout of 5G in certain countries and the incidence of COVID-19 in those countries. I'm going to show you that, and then I'm going to let you reach your own conclusion and decide what you want to decide. The bottom line is there is some type of correlation, and if there is a correlation, then why would there be a relationship between 5G and coronavirus? Is there a motive? Is there a reason for this? If I can show you that there's a connection, prepare to be disturbed. So let's start off with what actually is 5G. So the World Health Organization defines 5G a very specific way, and it talks about the electrical fields that are created by difference in voltage, and the higher the voltage, the higher and stronger the resulting field will be. Now, what 5G is the next generation of communication. Now, up to this point, the 3G and 4G, they were usually running between 50 cycles per second to 60 cycles per second, and this was measured in hertz. However, with the advent of 4G, it went up a little bit higher, and it goes up to around 200 to 300 hertz. The advent of 5G takes this up in order of magnitude times 3 or 4. We're going from 50 cycle, 60 cycle hertz to over 10 megahertz up to 300 gigahertz. So this is like exponentially greater electromagnetic fields that we're creating. These are radio frequency electromagnetic fields that we're creating. So prior to this, it was extremely low frequencies, what they called ELF fields. But now these fields have gone up to from, as I said, 50 to 60 hertz, maybe up to 900 hertz with some of the mobile devices that we held in our hands, now to an order of magnitude of 10 megahertz to 300 gigahertz. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about 5G. So it's important to understand that the difference between 3 and 4G to 5G is not just one generational, what you would think. It's a leap and bound. It's like going from a 2-dimensional image to a 5-dimensional image. It's massively different. It's not even close to being the same thing. All right. However, the attractive component of 5G dwarfed the actual concerns that we should have had about the rollout of 5G from a health perspective, from a wellness perspective, from a perspective of what does it do to the human physiology or to any physiology, to any living physiology. And that was virtually ignored. The World Health Organization basically took a back stance on this. All right. So what does actually the science show us? Now, there has been talk about 5G and the health risks, as I said before. But this particular article was very interesting because it talked about a war between technology and human beings. So this article was written in May of 2019, and it talked about 180 scientists and doctors in almost 40 countries that are warning the world about the 5G health risks. These scientists responded to Resolution 1815 of the Council of Europe and basically stated that the scientists and these doctors were against the rollout of 5G. And I will just read this to you so that you are aware of what it says. We, the undersigned scientists, recommend a moratorium on the rollout of the 5th generation 5G until potential hazards for human health and the environment have been fully investigated by scientists independent from the industry. The reason they said this was because the studies that have been done were riddled with conflict of interest because the scientists that were doing these studies were vested with the technology companies. 5G will substantially increase exposure to radio frequency electromagnetic fields, which is also, the acronym is RFEMF for radio frequency electromagnetic fields, and has been proven to be harmful for humans and the environment. Okay. Now, this author goes on to say, if you're not alarmed about 5G radiation dangers, you should be. And we'll talk about a little bit more about this, but I want to point out that this was 180 scientists and doctors in almost 40 countries, but that number significantly increases over the next 6 months, and we'll show you that. Now, 5G cancer is actually a thing, okay? The cities of Brussels and Geneva have blocked trials and banned upgrades to 5G out of this concern. So there are countries in the world that have banned it, that have said, no, we're not going to have 5G allowed. We are not going to tolerate it. Now, again, as I mentioned before, 4G and 5G, the difference is in the terms of gigahertz, all right? 5G comprises technology that promises radio millimeter bands in the 30 to 300 gigahertz, whereas 4G tops out around 6 gigahertz. Now, that's 4G at the most advanced level. Most of the 4G devices were only at around 900 hertz. That's about where, so you're talking about up to about maybe 1 gigahertz, okay? Maybe that was the highest. This is going up. 5G is going up to 30 to 300 gigahertz, 60 to 120 times faster internet, which again is really, really exciting to think about how much convenience it would be. But how many people are going to be enthusiastic about that convenience if it's associated and correlated with cancer and is statistically significant data that has been extrapolated from these studies to show the direct correlation? I don't think anybody would be. All right. So we never worried whether or not our drive time radio shows would fry our brains with the 2, 3, and 4Gs, but with 5Gs, it becomes an issue. While 4G wavelength travel along the surface of the skin, 5G millimeter waves are more insidious. 5G wavelengths are emitted, our skin will automatically absorb them. Now, it's important to mention that when you go through TSA, when you go through the airport security systems, when they take you through these devices where you raise your arm up, that is the same millimeter wave technology. That is the reason I didn't even know this at the time, but it just didn't make any sense to me. And I have never gone through one of those devices. And I fly quite frequently, sometimes as often as once a week. Now, I will tell you that I have missed 2 flights because of the pat downs, and it is a pain in the rear end, but I still refuse to do it because it just didn't make any sense to me based upon the little bit that I knew back then. I've looked at it more. I do know that taking certain supplements through there, I used to write letters for patients to be able to take their supplements through a different system. And I did know about the absorption from the skin, but what I didn't know was the significant amount of damage to the immune system that the 5G rendered. That's what I didn't know. Does 5G cause cancer? Many scientists understand microwave ovens are carcinogenic. They cause cancer. Most of these scientists also believe that these waves are mutagenic. All right. Mutagenic causes mutation. 5G will be similar to turning on your microwave. There's a good reason why hundreds of scientists are taking actions against the wireless industry. Now, let me talk to you about microwaves. We did a little study, myself and a colleague of mine who has now since passed, and his name was Dr. James Hauer, and we did a small little internal study between his clinic and my clinic to determine what the most significant cause from an energetic basis, what was the most significant contributing cause for cancer. And what we discovered was so alarming. This was back in 2001. So this was 19 years ago we did this. And the most significant exposure, energetic exposure, for those of you that don't know, I have a 7 toxicity philosophy. And basically, if these 7 toxicities are effectively addressed, where the body is detoxed from these 7 toxicities, by definition, chronic disease cannot exist. Cancer, heart disease, it doesn't make any difference. It can't exist. We have treated patients with end-stage cancer from 93 different countries. We have treated autism and all the difficult to diagnose from all over the world. And I can tell you that we have before and after videos of patients, hundreds and hundreds of patients. In the case of autism, we've treated over 3,800 patients. And we have been able to define quantitatively that if you can eliminate these 7 toxicities, by definition, chronic disease cannot exist. Of these 7 toxicities, the 4th one is the energetic toxicities. The energetic toxicities are things such as electromagnetic radiation, ambient cell phone radiation, microwave technologies, anything that causes an effect from an energetic source on the body. We found, Dr. Harvard and I found 19 years ago, that the most significant adverse effect from any energetic component that a person would experience that was suffering from cancer was from microwaves. And for that reason, I have not had a microwave in my house since 2001. Actually, I'd stopped using it in 2000. So for 20 years in my house or wherever I've lived, there has never been a microwave. In the clinic that I operated, there has never been a microwave in those last 20 years. And I will not tolerate or take in any food that has been put into a microwave. In fact, my children, my 15-year-old son and my 21-year-old son, have absolutely refused to eat anything that has come out of a microwave. In fact, my son, my 15-year-old son, my youngest son, Rahan, has never known the use of a microwave. When he was 6 years old on a vacation in Hawaii, they took a burrito and they put it in the microwave and he refused to eat it. He wouldn't eat it. Because he said it was in a microwave. He just would not eat it. So that's how my kids have been raised. Now come to find out that this new 5G network that's rolling out, that is analogous to a massive microwave that's going to be all around us. Not only that, but for each tower that is a 5G tower, it can only generate enough power for anywhere between 3 to 6 homes. Some people say up to 10 homes. Compared to the 4G networks that could power hundreds of homes per tower, now we have to have multiple towers, 5G towers, per 10 houses or 5 houses, whatever it is. In other words, we have to increase the number of towers by a significant order of magnitude in order to be able to have 5G utilization worldwide. It will not be like 4G. It will be much higher frequency of towers. And then, of course, we know the amount of energy that these things are putting out with the millimeter wave on the order of magnitude of gigahertz, going from 900 hertz to 30 to 300 gigahertz. It's astronomical amounts of microwave technology now we're going to be exposed to. Going on. The wireless industry is not just building an infrastructure that provides faster downloads. It's building a global microwave oven. They said it themselves. 5G towers and mini stations are extremely dangerous because of the intensity of the technology. It will also require millions of more mini cell towers than before, potentially 1 tower per 2 to 8 houses. All right. So what I had read before was anywhere from 2 to 10. Some people said 2 to 6. So 2 to 8 houses. We don't know the exact number, but that's what they're estimating. This means that human beings' radio frequency radiation exposure will not only increase, but it will also exponentially increase within months, within a very short time frame. These towers are not only dangerous, they're lethal. And the author goes on to say it should be considered a crime against humanity. In general, radiation does one major thing to the human beings and animals. It destroys our DNA either by forcing the DNA to mutate or by killing specific groups of cells, all of which lead to cancer. Cancer is a highly mutagenic, adaptogenic process. And when a person goes into the hospital and gets an x-ray because they broke their leg or they needed to have a chest x-ray or whatever, what's happening is there is radiation being introduced into the body. That's the reason that the radiologists or the radiation techs will wear lead to protect themselves. All right. Now, this is a question I've always asked. Why is it that they use lead to protect themselves? It's so that they don't get the radiation. Well, why is the radiation bad? Because it causes DNA adducts to form, to DNA mutation to form. Why is that bad? Because then that leads to cancer. Now, when somebody has cancer, what do? We give them radiation. We give them further exposure to things that will cause DNA adducts to form and mutations to occur. So that is a fundamental reason that radiation therapy is something to me that is counterproductive and doesn't make any sense. Why it's done? Because it defies logic. Einstein said that you cannot solve a problem with the same mindset that created it. Well, this use of radiation for the treatment of cancer has not made sense to me for at least the last 20 years. Now, what are we doing? We are actually promoting through something non-medical a technology that is going to expose our DNA to much higher levels of damage that can then lead to these DNA adducts to form and mutation to occur, which will then lead to cancer. So here's what to expect if you experience prolonged exposure to radiation. Nausea, swelling, hair loss, decreased appetite, low energy, general malaise, damaged bone marrow, damaged organs, deep depression, confusion, infections, incapacitation, and death. Okay? Pretty much things that nobody wants to experience. How do you protect yourself from 5G? Cell tower radiation health effects are real because there will be thousands of these towers and stations in every city. It will almost be impossible to avoid them. Given how addicted we are to our devices, the general public will tend toward risking life and limb to support our screen-related addictions. Now, here's the thing. Most people don't know about this. My hope is that people will learn about this and will then understand why we may want to consider a different option. But again, it's something that I've heard. I know that some people are sensitive to electromagnetic radiation. Some people are going to be sensitive to the 5Gs. But from a global standpoint, it was, again, something that it was coming out. It's part of technology. You do the best you can. You create ways to protect yourself, and there are devices out there that'll protect yourself. And if somebody's really interested in that, next Thursday, we will be doing a webinar, what you can do to protect yourself, but I'll talk about that in a few moments. All right. So there are things that you can do to protect yourself. But right now, the goal of this video is to determine if there's a correlation between 5G and coronavirus. All right. So let's go on to the next component. And this study, or this article, I should say, is actually talking whether 5G technology is bad for our health. Some experts strongly disagree that 5G is safe. All right. 5G has been designed to increase capacity and reduce latency. It will use higher frequency bandwidths right across the radio spectrum. What does 5G have to do with our health? The electromagnetic field, the field of energy that results from the electromagnetic radiation, a form of energy that occurs as a result of the flow of electricity. These electric fields are power lines operate between 50 and 60 hertz, as I mentioned earlier, and electric fields result from the flow of electricity, and the radiation that comes off of them is called electromagnetic radiation. RF EMF stands for radio frequency electromagnetic fields, include all wavelengths from 30 kilohertz to 300 gigahertz. Public exposure is mostly from handheld devices such as cell phones and tablets, but these things are relatively low electromagnetic frequencies, and the biological effects are usually limited to just heating. All right. In 2011, 30 international scientists who are part of a working group of the International Agency for Research on Cancer met to assess the risk of developing cancer as a result of exposure to radio frequency electromagnetic fields. This study was published in the Lancet Oncology. And I can show you that study if you are interested in that. In fact, we can go right here and pull that up. It's right there, actually. I'll come back to that. The team looked at 40 studies that used rats and mice. In the view of limited evidence in humans and experimental animals, the working group classified radio frequency electromagnetic fields as possibly carcinogenic to humans. The evaluation was supported by a large majority of the working group members. All right. Now, for me, that's good enough. If it's possibly carcinogenic, I don't want to have anything to do with it. But it goes on. Dr. Leonard Hartl from the Department of Oncology at Örebro University in Sweden is an outspoken critic of the WHO's decision not to adopt the IARC's classification for radio frequency electromagnetic frequencies as possibly carcinogenic. In the 2017 the International Journal of Oncology explained that several members of the EMF Project's core group are also affiliated with the ICNIRP, an organization he describes as an industry-loyal NGO. All right, now there is a direct conflict of interest that if you're a scientist working for a company that's rolling out 5G or somehow related to 5G, and then they're also doing a study on the safety of 5G, there's a inherent conflict of interest there. Being a member of ICNIRP is a conflict of interest in the scientific evaluation of health hazards from radiofrequency radiation through ties to military and industry, Dr. Hartle writes. All right, so that's not surprising. Of course, anybody that's got that conflict of interest should recuse themselves, but they did not recuse themselves from the study. They still participated and said that it was safe. Regardless, it was still assessed to be possibly carcinogenic, but the World Health Organization refused to accept that mandate and has said that it's safe, generally regarded as safe. Dr. Agostino Ciaula from the Division of the Internal Medicine at the Hospital of Bisceglie in Italy reviewed the latest studies, specifically revolving around radiofrequency electromagnetic fields in humans, animals, and microbes. He wrote, evidences about the biological properties of radiofrequency electromagnetic fields are progressively accumulating, and although they are in some cases still preliminary or controversial, clearly point to the existence of multi-level interactions between high-frequency electromagnetic fields and biological systems, and to the possibility of oncologic and non-oncologic, mainly reproductive, metabolic, neurologic, and microbiologic effects. Biological effects have also been recorded at exposure levels below the regulatory limits, leading to growing doubt about the real safety of the currency employed by ICNIRP standards. Now look, guys, I can keep on going on and on with this, but the National Toxicology Program study by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services looked at high-level exposures at 900 megahertz. They found clear evidence of tumors in the hearts of male rats, some evidence of tumors in the brains of male rats, and some evidence of tumors in the adrenal glands of male rats. In the Journal of the Environmental Research Group, a group of researchers from Cesare Malatoni Cancer Research Center in Bologna, Italy, found an increase in tumors in the heart in rats exposed to RF EMFs equivalent to 1.8 gigahertz base station. Remember, we're looking at 30 gigahertz to 300 gigahertz with the rollout of 5G. So they found this at relatively low levels at 1.8 gigahertz, and we're talking about a significant order of magnitude higher. There's certainly evidence that ties radiofrequency electromagnetic fields exposure to a small increase in the risk of developing certain cancers and other adverse health outcomes. That's if you look at it from a very conservative stance. If you look at it from an aggressive stance, it's a very high correlation. However, the only recommendation that's been made by the Food and Drug Administration is cutting down how much time we spend on our cell phones. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommended limiting the time that kids and teenagers spend on mobile devices. And that was basically it. That was the end of it. Now, what does this have to do with coronavirus? Well, it has a lot to do with coronavirus. We have no reason to believe 5G is safe. FCC adopted these limits based largely on research from the 1980s and preponderance of peer-reviewed research. More than 500 studies have found harmful biologic health effects from exposure to radio frequencies at intensities too low to cause significant heating. So there's been a lot of studies done on this. Then it goes on. Remember, before I showed you 180 scientists. Now that number goes up to 240 scientists have published peer-reviewed research on the biologic and health effects of non-ionizing electromagnetic fields, signed by the International EMF Scientists Appeal, which calls for stronger exposure limits. These scientists have published more than 2,000 papers and letters on EMFs in professional journals. Appeal arguably constitutes the majority of the experts on the effects of non-ionizing radiation. Now, I talked about the millimeters waves before, and I'm not going to repeat it again, but basically short-term exposure to these millimeter waves, the same stuff that you go through the security checkpoints at TSA, at the airports. Short-term exposure can have adverse physiological effects in the peripheral nervous system, the immune system, the cardiovascular system. The research also suggests that long-term exposure may pose health risks to the skin, including melanoma, the eyes, which is ocular melanoma, and the testes, testicular sterility or testicular cancer. 5G is a new technology. There's no research on health effects, so we are flying blind, to quote a U.S. senator. However, we have considerable evidence that the harmful effects of 2G and 3G, little is known with the effects of 4G, a 10-year-old technology, because governments have remained remiss in funding this research. And now we're going to go from 900 hertz to 30 gigahertz to 300 gigahertz. And we know that already studies have been done to show a correlation at just 1.8 gigahertz with all sorts of different types of cancer. Again, why am I talking about this when we should be talking about coronavirus? Well, I was curious. I want to establish first how damaging 5G is for you, since I wasn't aware of a lot of this literature, and by delving into this, I started seeing how damaging it really is. By the way, I'm now one of those scientists that signed that petition as well. And that number has now risen to 208,000 individuals that have signed that petition from 200 different countries. Now this is the Lancet Oncology paper that is showing carcinogenicity of radiofrequency electromagnetic fields. Made 2011. Remember, it was 30 scientists from 14 countries that met, and they basically found that there was, I'll just get right to the chase of it, and you guys can look at this information if you want. There were multiple studies that they did, epidemiological studies looking at the radiofrequency electromagnetic fields that were created and the cancer outcomes from these cohort studies. There was one called the Interphone study. It was a multi-center case study, and it looked at 2,708 cases of glioma. There was also a Swedish research group study that was done that looked at two very similar studies, and they basically looked at a total cases of 1,148 glioma cases. And then there was an additional study that was done in Japan that's also found some evidence. The working group's conclusion was that there is limited evidence in humans for the carcinogenicity for radiofrequency electromagnetic fields based on positive associations between glioma and acoustic neuroma and exposure to RF EMFs from wireless phones. They assessed more than 40 studies that assessed the carcinogenicity of the RF EMFs in rodents, and they basically ended up classifying radiofrequency electromagnetic fields as possibly carcinogenic to humans. All right, now I'm going to stop talking about cancer and 5G and come to coronavirus. 5G deployment has been referred as a dangerous experiment on humanity, and there are numerous theories surrounding 5G, citing numerous mechanisms, including phased array technology that may induce adverse health consequences. When coronavirus came out, there was all sorts of things that started happening. Okay, people started talking about different things. They were talking about the biological effects of non-ionizing radio frequencies showing DNA damage, which we've talked about, the oxidative stress component, which we've talked about, and leading to a variety of diseases, including infertility and neurodegeneration. The problem is that it causes a certain change in the calcium channel blockers. It's been demonstrated to induce calcium ion efflux, where radio frequency is observed to pump ions through the calcium channel and pores bound in the bilipid membranes, and this calcium efflux through the activation of voltage-gated calcium channels. It is not one-sided. Now, what is the significance to this? Calcium channel blockers are a class of drugs that are used for many cardiovascular conditions. And when you start affecting the calcium efflux or influx into cells, it causes a disruption in the ionic gradients across cell membranes. Now, this is going to get technical, so there's a reason that I'm not going to talk about it in more detail. For anybody that's interested, I will have these references available to you if you want. Essentially, I just want you to remember that cancer is a biological effect from these 5Gs. And now we also see that calcium efflux is a biological response that can lead to different outcomes. We know this calcium in the wrong places is pathognomonic for cancer, and for apoptosis, calcium in the right places is essential for life. So the influx of calcium ions through VGCs is a necessary step in the initiation of apoptosis. Apoptosis is programmed cell death. Suppression of apoptosis is concurrent and conducive with cancer. So when you have cancer, there's a suppression of this apoptotic mechanism, and we don't want that because the association with uncontrolled cellular proliferation and suppression of apoptosis is the essential definition of cancer. A high level of calcium in mitochondria is essential to initiate apoptosis cell death, yet influx of calcium does not mean certain death for certain cells. Therefore, there is a suppression of apoptosis, which is concurrent and correlates with cancer. EMFs at 4 watts per kilogram, 5 hours per day responded with increased autophagy that actually inhibited apoptosis. Again, remember, we don't want to inhibit apoptosis. We don't want to suppress apoptosis. Increased autophagy changed genetic expression of calcium channels, ultimately affecting calcium homeostasis, inhibiting apoptosis. For those that are doctors, those that are scientists, you understand the significance of this. If you are not, don't worry about it. The point is that it helps to create the oncogenic process that then leads on to cancer. All right. all electromagnetic radiation causes membrane depolarization, and there's more and more of this. So it comes down to the coronavirus here, and it asks, is the coronavirus and depolarization, is 5G the Trojan horse? As early as 2009, millimeter waves were found to interact with lipid membranes, leading to changes at the membrane-water interface that were charged and dipolar residues are located. Numerous studies showed microwave radiation, again 5G, induced cell apoptosis as a result of mitochondrial membrane depolarization, chromatin condensation, and DNA fragmentation. All right. Now I want you to listen to this. This is very important. The COVID-19 and other coronaviruses like SARS coronavirus encode proteins known as envelope E proteins that can modify host cell membrane permeability in order to gain entry into host cells, promoting replication, release, and proliferation. These proteins are able to form ion channels to induce membrane permeability changes. This is very important because a coronavirus is an enveloped virus, just like the hepatitis C virus. It's an enveloped virus, and it allows essentially the burrowing through the cell membrane that then creates issues where the ion channels essentially start to leak. Okay, that's a very rudimentary way of explaining it, but these proteins are able to form ion channels to induce membrane permeability changes. It can cause a disruption, these proteins that are found that are associated with the coronavirus, with the COVID-19 and other such types of viruses. Membrane permeabilization can be the direct cause of depolarization leading to apoptosis. The successful invasion by coronavirus enveloped proteins as a result of membrane integrity already severely compromised from constant exposure to EMRs is analogous to the role of the Trojan horse in the fall of Troy. What does that mean? That means that it's cloaked and we don't even realize that basically the 5G is helping to make the coronavirus accessible to the cells and allows it to get into the cells easier than it would were there no 5G around, is basically what this is saying. All right. So is it possible that the deployment of 5G technology exacerbated the vulnerability to the attack by COVID-19? The bulk of the evidence presented points to the fact that all frequencies of EMR, from those from the sun to basic electricity, have the ability to alter membrane potential, without a doubt. The only difference is that 5G is where normal electromagnetic fields that are being generated from power lines and from our devices is 50 to 60 hertz, all the way up to maybe 900 hertz. We're now talking about, with 5G rollout, we're talking about 30 to 300 gigahertz. Much, much different. All right. Now, this is asking the question if 5G could have potentiated the effects of COVID-19. But I wanted to know, is it possible that just looking at the areas in the world that were affected the most, is it possible that there was a correlation? So this thing comes out, is coronavirus linked to China's rollout of 5G biowarfare? The question was asked, and it was a good question. The undisputed global leader in the development and deployment of 5G is China. Undisputed. Nobody argues with that. By the way, this was in February 2000. It therefore may come as a surprise to learn that the urban testing ground for the first full-scale deployment of 5G network was the Chinese city of Wuhan, the epicenter of the coronavirus, aka COVID-19. Is this a mere coincidence, or is there a link? On April 6, 2018, an official statement on the website of the Chinese province of Hubei announced that the city of Wuhan, with approximately 11 million residents, would be the pilot city for the deployment of 5G. Now, if you remember from the first video, I talked about this component, and I also talked about the outgassing from the incinerators, from the pollution that was so bad that it garnered international attention, and BBC and CNN and many other media sources covered this atrocity where the people were complaining, and it was very, very bad. Now you're talking about that population that's already toxic, and now you're talking about Wuhan being the epicenter for not only the breakout of COVID-19, but also being the central launching pad, urban testing ground for 5G. And I've just shown you an article before that talked about how 5G changes cell membrane permeability and allows for efflux of enveloped viruses to come in and out, leave alone all the other aspects that 5G does as far as damaging the immune system and inducing oncogenic process and causing cancer. By the way, let's just go to that. Here it is. April 2018. Wuhan as a pilot city to build 5G telecoms has been approved by the central government. 3,000 macro base stations and 27,000 micro base stations will soon be constructed. By the end of 2018, the trial will use the technology will start in various pilot areas. It is expected to be accessible by users at the Military World Games in 2019. By 2020, 5G network will cover every corner of the city and will be available at an affordable price. Again, 5G network coming to Wuhan, April 2018. All right. I'm just going to go on from here. I wanted you guys to see this. And in fact, let me just make sure you guys can see this. Again, April 2018, Wuhan, 3,000 macro base stations, 27,000 micro base stations will soon be constructed. So now I'm going to ask a question. Which two countries were hit the hardest from coronavirus, from the COVID-19? The answer is Iran and Italy, not China. Iran and Italy. So is there a correlation? If I'm right about this correlation with 5G, if these people that have asked the question are correct, then there should be a correlation. So let's see. Iran committed to 5G rollout, May 2019. The government of Iran says it plans to push ahead with the rollout of 5G in the face of economic and trade sanctions imposed by the U.S. Preparations for 5G deployment are high on the agenda for 2019. Iran and Italy were both vying to be leaders in the 5G rollout. Here's another article. In 3 months, we will have provided the condition for experts in the field to learn all there is about 5G technology, and by 2020, we will have begun executing our action plan. This is Iran ready to take a step forward towards 5G, published in September of 2019. Here's another one. This is specifically talking about the launch of the 5G internet and in which cities they were talking about. There were two specific cities that there was the highest incidence of the COVID-19 deaths. So this one's talking about the country will kick off the 5th generation of internet communications known as 5G in the next Persian calendar, and goes on to talk about what they're going to do. Let's go on to Italy. In Italy, there's a video here talking about how Vodafone Italy turned Milan into an extensive 5G testbed. Anybody who wants to listen to this video, it's a considerably long video, and it's basically all you need to know about it is exactly what this headline says. Italy turned Milan into an extensive 5G testbed. And this is a quarantine Italian coronavirus epicenter transformed into a 5G testbed prior to the outbreak. Okay, this video shows it. And I will have the link here if you guys want to see this. And what cities in Italy got hit the hardest? Well, that's an interesting question as well. Just like with Iran, I will come to that in a second. Italy's new government on Thursday approved its use of special powers to supply deals for 5th generation 5G telecom services by a number of domestic firms. The measure was adopted under a law passed by the previous government in July to broaden powers Rome has over companies of national interest. This was September 2019. Again, they're vying for this, right? The government said that it was going to roll this out, said it would also exercise special powers over the Fastweb's purchase of radio components from ZTE for systems that could adopt 5G technologies. They were hitting it hard. They wanted this bad. They wanted to be the leaders. Italian Telecos gets ready to reach more cities with 5G in 2020. This was in the beginning, in January 6, 2020, before COVID became really prevalent in Italy. They weren't even talking about it then in Italy. Italian operators kicked off commercial 5G offerings in part of the country's main cities during the second half of 2019 and have already announced plans to rapidly expand coverage during 2020. All right. Now, Milan, Turin, Bologna, Rome, and Naples, and the area that was hit the hardest, one of the hardest, we'll talk about that in a second, The operator said the speeds of the 5G will increase progressively up to 10 gigabytes per second by 2021. 5G services will be offered through spectrum in the 700 megahertz and then going up to the 3.6 to 3 gigahertz and then 26.5 to 27 gigahertz bands. So the 700 megahertz, okay, that's pretty much what 4G is at right now. 3.6 to 3.8 gigahertz, they're rolling that out. That's much higher. And then, of course, when we get to 26.5 to 27.5 gigahertz, that's seriously high. 2019 June, local operators announced a strategic agreement leveraging operators' respective assets in order to accelerate the rollout of the national 5G network. And then it goes on. They announced the completion of the national 5G spectrum tender in 2018 for a total cost of 6.55 billion euro. What cities? A little city by the name of Lombardy has the highest number of deaths related to the coronavirus. That was just released at towards the end of March 23rd, March 24th. And the development of 5G in Lombardy starts at Monza. This is basically one of the places that they started demonstrating the new services and applications of the 5G. This was one of the highest epicenters, and I don't have data for all the different cities. But again, I wanted to look at the cities, the countries, and the rollout of 5G. So Wuhan, where the epicenter of coronavirus, the COVID-19 started, it was the same month, December, that they launched those towers. And then you've got Italy and Iran with the two highest casualty rates. And both of those countries had 5G rollouts at the same time. And both of them were vying to be leaders in the 5G industry. Now, remember what I told you in the beginning of the third video, part 3. And what that was the association between a industry that has to take responsibility for some type of technology that can cause harm versus blaming it on a virus, because the virus, it's nobody's fault, right? It's a naturally occurring phenomena. So is it possible that the 5G rollouts were potentiating this versus that the COVID-19 was blamed for something that the 5G caused? Well, I think it's part and parcel combination of both. I don't think that they really realized that the COVID-19 was going to happen the way it did. Of course, we created it. Mankind created it. It was developed, as we talked about on part 3, which is I showed the studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. That's where the technology was developed, and it was taken back to Wuhan, and the alteration of these chimeric viruses that created COVID-19 based upon the SHC014 surface proteins on top of a backbone of a SARS coronavirus component, and then had orthologs that were placed into this. Other additional protein nucleotides were added to create a very virulent form of this virus called the COVID-19. That then introduced into an environment that's potentiated with 5G, that's causing havoc with your cell membranes, allowing for permeability of the virus and other enveloped viruses to permeate through the cell and create an infection. Just exacerbated the situation. Now, I've shown the correlation between Wuhan, Italy, and Iran. But does that mean that if there's a city or area in the world where it has very low incidence of coronavirus, then what would the correlation be? Would that be safe to assume that then there wasn't any 5G? And this is what I'm going to show. The last place in the United States to show a case of 5G, the last place in the United States to show a case of COVID-19 was an area of West Virginia. All right. And in fact, now there has been a couple of cases. There have been a few cases that have shown up there, but they were all from Washington, D.C. people coming in. But in that area, there was a very conspicuous absence of COVID-19. That area was defined as, in fact, this site actually talked about it, but now they've changed their information. They don't show it because before it was West Virginia had 0 cases. And when you clicked on it, it actually talked about the area that did not have any incidence of COVID-19. But this area is called the National Radio Quiet Zone, and it was established by the Federal Communications Commission in November 1958. And it's an area that is basically to minimize possible harmful interference to the National Radio And it was established to minimize possible harmful interference to the National Radio Astronomy Observatory in Green Bank, West Virginia, and the radio receiving facilities for the United States Navy in Sugar Grove, West Virginia. All right. So it's to minimize possible harmful interference to the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. It encloses a land area of approximately 13,000 square miles near the state border between Virginia and West Virginia. And there was a very, very conspicuous absence of COVID-19 up until I think it was March 21st. It's only about 4 days ago did the first case show up there, and it showed up from somebody traveling from Washington, D.C. So anyway, I just wanted to show that. Here is the scientists who have not wanted the implementation of 5G. September 13th, 2017. That time it was 180 scientists. That number has now grown considerably. I don't know exactly how many scientists, but a total of 208,000 people have signed it, of which I think about over 1,000 are scientists and doctors from 204 countries, from what I understand. Recommend a moratorium on the rollout of the 5G telecommunications until potential hazards for human health and environment have been fully investigated by scientists independent from the industry. Radio frequency electromagnetic fields have been proven to be harmful for humans and the environment. 5G technology is effective only short distance. It is poorly transmitted through solid material. Many new antennas will be required, and full-scale implementation will result in antennas every 10 to 12 houses in urban areas, thus massively increasing mandatory exposure. Many scientists from many countries have expressed their serious concerns regarding the ubiquitous and increasing exposure to EMFs generated by electric and wireless devices already before the additional 5G rollout. Numerous scientific publications have shown EMF affects living organisms at levels well below most international and national guidelines, including cancer risk, cellular stress, increase in harmful free radicals, genetic damages, structural and functional changes of the reproductive system, learning and memory deficits, neurological disorders, and negative impacts on general well-being in humans. Damage goes well beyond the human race, as there is growing evidence of harmful effects to both plants and animals. I believe now we can add to that enveloped virus permeability is increased by the exposure of 5G, because the science has clearly established that with the membrane permeability component that I showed you with the calcium channel blockers. The world's largest study, $25 million of the National Toxicology Program, shows statistically significant increases in the incidence of brain and heart cancers in animals exposed to EMF below the ICNIRP, the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection guidelines, followed by most countries. These results support results in human epidemiological studies on radiofrequency radiation and brain tumor risk. A large number of peer-reviewed scientific reports demonstrate harm to human health from EMFs. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, the Cancer Agency of the World Health Organization in 2011 concluded that EMF frequencies of 30 kilohertz to 300 gigahertz are possibly carcinogenic to humans. However, new studies like the NTP study mentioned above and several epidemiological investigations, including the latest studies on mobile phone use and brain cancer risks, confirm that radiofrequency electromagnetic field radiation is carcinogenic to humans. There is also strong evidence that long-term exposure to certain EMFs is a risk factor for diseases such as, besides cancers, Alzheimer's disease and male infertility. Electromagnetic hypersensitivity symptoms include headaches, concentration difficulties, sleep problems, depression, lack of energy, fatigue, and flu-like symptoms. Inaction is a cost to society and is not an option anymore. By us sitting on the sidelines thinking that this is not going to affect us, you have now been shown how it is affecting you. We unanimously acknowledge the serious hazard to public health, that major primary preventive measures are adopted and prioritized to face this worldwide pan-epidemic in perspective. And what's the conclusion? The conclusion is still, what is the scientific evidence related to RF and health? The Federal Communications Commission regulates RF emissions from wireless devices. It has reaffirmed its safety standards on a unanimous and bipartisan basis, saying Get this, guys. This is the Federal Communications Commission reaffirmed its safety standards on a unanimous and bipartisan basis, saying there is no evidence to support that adverse health effects in humans are caused by exposures at, under, or even in some cases above the current RF limits. Indeed, no scientific evidence establishes a causal link between wireless device use and cancer or other illnesses. I just showed you studies. I just showed you the physiology. I just showed you permeability. I just showed you evidence of multiple scientists in multiple countries talking about how dangerous this is. And the Federal Communications Commission still says, hey guys, it's safe. So now you decide if there is a correlation between 5G rollout in Iran, in Italy, in Wuhan, very coincidentally the same months, they're vying for the highest rollout, the fastest rollout. And in the cities where there was the most COVID-19 deaths were the cities that were the test grounds for the rollout of the 5G. And remember, they can't blame an industry if it's a natural cause. So what they do, they took a man-made, adulterated, chimeric virus and blamed it on that, the COVID-19, and they have blown it totally out of proportion. It's all about the 5G. They've created the virus, but they blamed on the virus as a natural thing, so no industry can be affected by the 5G. And now what's coming down the pipeline is that they're going to come up with a vaccine. I'm telling you right now, the research conclusively shows this is not something that a vaccine can be made for. This virus is a man-made virus that cannot have a vaccine made for it. But I will show you what you can do yourself to prevent the COVID-19 from creating any kind of problem in your system if you can maintain a certain blood level of this naturally occurring nutrient. I will show you that. It's not going to cost you anything except for a few dollars from a health food store, or you can boost up your level if you want. But the key thing to remember is that the COVID-19, even though it's adulterated and it's chimeric virus, it's very self-limiting. Okay. It burns out fast. And unless you're immunocompromised, you have nothing to worry about. And if you are immunocompromised, there are certain things you can do. But the hysteria that's been created around it and people staying 6 feet apart from each other and the global economy shutting down and no more conferences and everything, it's absolutely ludicrous. Now, if what I'm saying doesn't make sense to you and you think I'm crazy, hey, shut this down and go on living your life and go get the vaccine and God be with you. For the rest of you that have a critical mind, that understand basic fundamental concepts, that can follow a logical sequential thought process, you now see the truth. And for those of you that understand this, then there's a conference coming up on May 23rd to May 26th. Okay. I'm going to give you a plug. The Advanced Medicine Conference, the second annual conference. We have some of the leading healthcare providers from all over the world that are going to be presenting there. So we welcome all. You don't have to be a doctor or a healthcare provider to come, but some of the people that are going to be there are healers from all over the world. Dr. Bruce Lipton is going to be one of the speakers there. And when I put out the notice to the speakers that we were not going to cancel, within 10 minutes, I had 3 of the speakers from 3 different parts of the world contact me and say, thank you, Rashid, for taking a stance. Thank you for not succumbing to this paranoia, to this BS. So guys, I welcome you to come to Advanced Medicine Conference. And if you are concerned about the COVID-19, then you really should be at this conference so you can understand what the facts are. I hope this information has been informative for you. The next video is coming out in about 48 hours, and we're going to call out some of the people that are putting out misinformation. And then I'm going to have a video to help show you what you can do, the help that you can get. Pay this forward. Let your friends and family know about it. Stop promoting the hysteria. Allow people to know the truth and pass this information forward so that we can get our economy back on track and understand what the real issues are and demand that this type of garbage is, 1, not tolerated anymore, and 2, that we as a nation, we as a people of this planet will no longer tolerate this type of garbage, this type of misinformation, this type of manipulation, and this type of atrocity being committed on our physiologies, on our bodies, on our children's bodies. We're not going to tolerate it anymore. Pay it forward, pass it on, tell everyone about it. long day, but I wanted to make sure I get this information out to you as promised. So it's about 6 o'clock, actually 6:30 in the morning, and wanting to make sure that this information goes out. It's just a tremendous amount of information to go through, so I think you'll understand what I'm talking about when you watch the video. Now, in the interest of time, I want to just cover a couple of comments that have been made previously by some people that have watched the video. And the predominant comment has been to compare the information that I presented and say that the comparison between cancer, for example, and COVID-19 or coronavirus is not accurate because you can't die from cancer. That was actually a comment that was made. But of course, we know that's not true. But I think what they were trying to say, and what the majority of the other comments were, was that cancer won't kill you within a few days, whereas coronavirus will. Well, that's not really accurate. And most of the people that are getting infected are recovering. So this particular video is about the scientific corruption that you as the public must realize. And I'm going to present the information to you and let you decide whether it constitutes corruption or not. You be the ultimate judge. Now, before we get going on the actual topic, I just want to again reiterate this issue with the recurrent question that to compare cancer or to compare motor vehicle accidents to the coronavirus is not accurate. It's not fair because you're not going to catch something and die from cancer like you will the coronavirus. So let's actually talk about that. Again, this is the Worldometer, and this is the number of people on the planet right now. And we're just going to zero back in because I did talk about this. The number of people that have died so far since January 1st, 2020 from the seasonal flu is 110,823. 110,000 from the seasonal flu. This is infectious. This is contagious. This is something people catch. From communicable diseases, okay, these are diseases that can be transmitted from one individual to another individual. You're looking at 2,959,790. Now, this is just a hair under 3 million. This is again from January 1st, 2020 till today, which is early morning, March 24th. Now, when people say that, well, you can't compare an infectious disease such as coronavirus with something like cancer, well, let's just compare it to communicable diseases then. So we got 110,000 people that died of the seasonal flu, which is part of these other communicable diseases, 2.95 million. Now let's look at that number compared to the coronavirus, 16,000 deaths. All right. So you're talking about a cause of disease that people will catch from someone else, 16,758 that have died compared to 110,000. Again, 110,000 from just the seasonal flu and 2.9 million worldwide from any other type of communicable infectious disease process. Again, 16,000 versus 2.9 million, and we're getting our knickers into a twist. I'm pretty sure that the people that made those comments were actually trolls that were paid to try to negate what I had said. It doesn't matter. People can say whatever they want to say. This is the issue. 102,000 of these people have recovered. This is the number died. This is the number that recovered. And most of these people, of the 102,000 that have recovered within 24 to 48 hours. Now, just tonight, and I'm going to show this to you to show you how unreliable the testing is, which I talked about on the first video. It gets really crazy. So I want to show you a couple things. The first is, this article was a fantastic article, but it was taken down from multiple different websites where it had been posted for whatever reason. I'm not sure the reason why it was taken down, but it was more likely than not censorship related. Now, this person's name is Aaron Ginn or Aaron Jin. Fantastic article, Evidence Over Hysteria COVID-19. And I have the whole article in its original form, and we will be posting this up. Anybody that wants this information, we are going to post this up on advancedmedicine.com. We will not have it available just right on the front. It will be on the back, so nobody can try to complain about it or nobody can try to censor it. So we are going to have it. If you register, you will be able to get access to it. It's not going to cost you anything, but it will also give you the ability to take the head map, which is the Advanced Health Evaluation Assessment for Detoxification, if you want. But this article is a very important article, and I think that everybody should read it. And the reason simply is because there is a lot of logical, very scientifically organized information that will help to make those that are not aware of really what the facts are and to see what the facts really are in order to make a logical, sequential decision as to whether or not this constitutes evidence of hysteria or not. And it actually is very clear, even without reading the study, that that's what it is once you understand the information. The other thing that I wanted to explain before we get into the evidence of the scientific corruption is that the Centers for Disease Control, when they are trying to determine the cause of death, when there's more than a few people that have died, when there's some type of issue where the Centers for Disease Control is warranted to investigate to find the cause of death, they send out two teams. Now, we always hear, like in the movies, the outbreak and the Ebola and all this stuff, and all these movies, everybody glorifies the primary team that everybody knows about from the CDC, which is the infectious disease team, okay? They send out the infectious disease team to find the source of infection. But there's a second team they also send out, but nobody glorifies that team, and that's the toxicological team. So nobody talks about the toxicological team. And in this particular case, as with almost all pathology, there is always a toxicological component. So why didn't they talk about the toxicological component? It's very simple. The reason is because if it's a toxicological issue, somebody has to take responsibility. Some company, some corporation, some industry that actually allowed that contaminant to get out. But when you blame it on a virus or a bacteria or some other pathogen, well, then it's naturally occurring. So now no industry or corporation or business or individual is going to be held responsible because it's going to be attributed to a natural cause. That's the difference, and I want you to keep that in mind, because on the next video, we're going to be talking about a major industry that people have been talking about that is directly related to this. And because they couldn't allow a major industry to take a hit, that's why the coronavirus was blamed for this. But now let's get into the scientific corruption aspect. We're going to start off with a little bit of history about the coronavirus. This article actually gives a short, brief history of the human coronavirus, which first was described in 1965 by a few researchers named Tyrrell and Baino. It was found in the human embryonic tracheal organ cultures obtained from the respiratory tracts of an adult with a common cold. And it has been attributed to the source of a common cold for a number of decades. Now, in the late 1960s, Tyrrell was leading a group of virologists looking at a specific strain and was working with human strains and a number of animal viruses. Now, these included infectious bronchitis virus, as well as mouse hepatitis virus and transmittable gastroenteritis virus from the porcine source, from swine, from pigs, all of which had been demonstrated to be morphologically the same as seen through electron microscopy as each other. So what this is basically saying is, from the morphological characteristics when looking through an electron microscope, the swine flu version or the swine virus version of this coronavirus, as well as the mouse hepatitis version, which affects the liver, as well as the infectious bronchitis virus that was found in humans, were all morphologically the same. This new group of viruses was then named coronavirus, corona denoting the crown-like appearance of the surface projections, and was later officially accepted as a new genus of viruses. So this goes back to the 1960s. In the 3 decades after discovery, human strains OC43 and 229E were studied exclusively, largely because they were the easiest ones to work with. It was easy to work with those, so that's what they predominantly worked with. Now, there were other ones, obviously, but those are the ones that they worked with. Now, what they found was from an epidemiologic and from a volunteer inoculation study, they found that the respiratory coronaviruses were associated with a variety of respiratory illnesses. However, their pathogenicity, i.e. their disease-causing ability, was considered to be low. So, not a big deal. Okay, that's basically what it comes down to. Now, while the research was proceeding to explore the pathogenicity, the ability for this to cause disease, and the epidemiology, the incidence of how virulent this virus was, and of this coronavirus, the number and importance of animal coronaviruses were growing rapidly. So they were starting to see this in other species. Chances are they were always there, we just were discovering them. Coronaviruses were described that cause diseases in multiple animals, including rats, mice, chickens, turkeys, calves, dogs, cats, rabbits, and pigs. Animal studies included, but were not limited to, research that focused on respiratory disorders. The study focus included disorders of the gastroenteritis, hepatitis, and encephalitis in mice. Now that's the gut, inflammation of the gut, inflammation of the liver, and inflammation of the brain in mice, as well as pneumonitis and sialodacrodinitis in rats, and then infectious peritonitis in cats. So these are all different types of peritonitis, for example, is inflammation of the peritoneum, the lining within the gut. It doesn't make any difference what these different things were. The point is they were studying them in different animals. All right. Then in the early 2000s, SARS came about. And the emergence of SARS, which is an acronym that stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, was the turning point when we started to look at the coronavirus with a different viewpoint. So during 2002-2003 outbreak, the SARS infection was reported in 29 countries in North America, South America, Europe, and Asia. Overall, over 8,000 people were infected, and the specific strain was called 774 SARS related, and those were the fatalities. It's still unclear how the virus entered the human population and whether the Himalayan palm civet, which is a type of a cat, were the natural reservoir for the virus. That's what it was attributed to. They later did sequential analysis of the virus, and they isolated from Himalayan palm cats and revealed that this virus contained a 29 nucleotide sequence not found in most human isolates. So basically, there were 29 nucleotide components that were different from humans, that humans didn't have, but these cats had it. And so that's why they attributed it to a spread from these civets. All right. Now, it was the SARS epidemic that actually launched the interest into coronavirus. And there was a lot of effort, time, money put in to understand the coronavirus. And most of the pathogenesis of the coronavirus infections were accumulated from the veterinary virological arena. So most of the veterinarians that were working with viruses actually contributed a lot of the research to our understanding of coronavirus. So that's just a brief history of where coronavirus started. The SARS epidemic was a dramatic reminder that animal coronaviruses are potential threats to the human population, although the exact mechanism of species to species spread still has not been determined. All right. It was felt to be spreading from animals, but they still never established it. Now let's go on to the current issue with the coronavirus that has caused the outbreak in 2020, and look at the specific version of this coronavirus. So this particular version is called COVID-19. Now, it's been labeled as a bioweapon by some people, and of course, the media, says that that's conspiracy theory, blah, blah, blah. But let's look at the actual configuration of what this virus, what COVID-19 is, all right? So the first thing is I want to say that this wasn't because people were eating bat soup, okay? Or transferred from snakes or sloths or whatever they said. The virus is not a naturally occurring phenomena. This is very important, and I'm going to show you evidence of that, all right? Back over 20 years ago, the Chinese government talked about how their long-range plan for ensuring Chinese national sovereignty, if you will, was going to involve the use of biological weapons. Now, here's what it comes down to. There's no possibility that this virus occurred naturally. This was confirmed on February 8th by peer-reviewed Virology Journal, Volume 16, publication date April 2020. So this is coming out next month, but I will show you. In fact, here is the study, and you can see published date is April 2020, and it's talking about the spike glycoprotein of the new coronavirus 2019 nCoV, which is basically the COVID-19, contains a furin-like cleavage site absent in coronavirus of the same clade. So this furin-like cleavage site is absent in the regular coronavirus. It is present in COVID-19. That's very, very important, and I will come back to that. There's an underlying implication here that this is very subtle, but the only possible reason for this modification is the creation of a biological warfare weapon. There are no other plausible explanations. Now, that sounds a little far-fetched, I agree, but wait, you're going to understand. Because when you start understanding this furin cleavage component that we're talking about, then it starts to make a little bit of sense. But why would somebody do that? Well, or how can we prove that somebody actually did that? So we're going to talk about that. Now, this virus was actually created at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and they published the highlights of the creation in November 2015. The list of scholars associated with this Frankenstein of a virus, you'll see, named Zheng Li Shi, who just happens to represent the key laboratory of special pathogens and biosafety, Wuhan Institute of Virology, Chinese Academy of Sciences, Wuhan, China. Of course, there were other scientists, but most of them representing the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill location, but there were also representatives from the Bellinzona Institute of Microbiology from Zurich, Switzerland, as well as Harvard Medical School. All right. Now, Dr. Shi, she's a key figure here. In 2014, Dr. Shi was the recipient of a number of U.S. government grants, as well as grants from the National Basics Research Program of China, the Chinese Academy of Science, the National Natural Science Foundation of China, and from the Strategic Priority Research Program of Chinese Academy of Sciences to assist in funding research into coronaviruses. Now, this is, remember, 2015. All right. What's interesting is that the U.S. government paid Dr. Shi and the Chinese government to fund research into coronaviruses. Now, what did we get for this research that we paid, the taxpayer money went for? So this is what we got. Using the SARS-CoV genetic system, it goes into some specifics on the type of viruses that we're looking at, the backbone of the virus. The results indicate that group 2B viruses encoding the specific version that they were looking at in a wild-type backbone, this is SHC014 spike in a wild-type backbone, meaning the naturally occurring virus, can efficiently use multiple orthologs of the SARS receptor human angiotensin-converting enzyme ACE2. Now, I'm going to talk about this issue with the angiotensin-converting enzymes in a later video. It's not pertinent here, but it is pertinent when we start talking about some of the misinformation regarding treatments that's coming out. Goes on to say that both monoclonal antibody and vaccine approaches failed to neutralize and protect from infection with coronavirus using the novel spike protein. So this novel spike protein was essentially something that they introduced into the coronavirus, and it essentially was a morphological departure from the naturally occurring coronavirus using the backbone of the virus. The implications are very, very suspect. All right, so they took SARS, the virus that caused SARS in 2002, 2003, and that was carried by bats, making the rounds back in 2003, and reverse engineered the genetic coding itself inside the virus. Now, they took the backbone of the original wild-type virus, and that's when they started messing around with it. They then inserted additional proteins to enhance the efficacy of the virus inside the human lungs, specifically inside for the human aspect, making it extremely difficult to vaccinate against because a new virus has multiple proteins with which to attack. So basically what they did was they made a bug, a virus, into a super virus. What would be the purpose of doing such a thing? Well, it'll become self-evident here in a few moments. What's also interesting is that these coronaviruses that they took from the SARS component and then they manipulated them, these cells were originally obtained from Fort Detrick. You may remember that Fort Detrick was also where some of the other HIV testing had been done and research had been done. And my friend Garth Nicholson, who used to be the director of laboratory at MD Anderson, wrote a book called Project Daylily about his work with some of the stuff that happened with the special forces, some of the research that was done at Fort Detrick, some of the stuff that was done from in the HIV arena. And again, a lot of the stuff was done at Fort Detrick. So it's interesting that the correlation, this is like, 20, 25 years ago. All right, so they say in the paper in 2015, remember they went back, this is going on from 2003 to 2015 now. They were looking at the SARS component from 2003, the coronavirus that caused SARS, and they were now manipulating that. And they published this manipulation study. But after they manipulated it, they published it in this 2015 paper. And they created this hybrid virus, which is far more deadly and can't be vaccinated against. It is resistant to vaccination because of certain morphological changes that were created to the wild type backbone. The new DNA genetically engineered virus constitutes a gain in pathogenesis. Now, I want you to remember what gain in pathogenesis means, okay? Or gain of function is the term that they use in virology, or actually in research. So gain of function. Okay, here it is. That's a gain of function right there. They admit it. Gain of function basically means taking something and making it more potent, all right? So pathogenesis means the lethalness and the infectiousness of something. The pathogenesis is the cause of the actual problem, cause of the disease. And Dr. Shi learns how to perform gain of function operations within viruses, and then she returns to her post in Wuhan, China. So she learned this in University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. They get the cells from Fort Detrick, and now she goes back to Wuhan, which is where the techniques that she learned about gain of function were then applied. Fast forward to November 2019, a breach of containment occurs at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and patient 0 is detected somewhere between December 1st and December 12th. Now, we don't know about the details. We don't know who the patient 0 was, but apparently there was a breach and containment. Now, I'm just going to quickly go over this. Dr. Shi is one of the authors that published this paper in January 23rd, 2020, stating that it is of probable bat origin. The problem is she knows what it is and what the origin is because she was the one who created it. Okay, she helped to enhance it. This is an enhanced version of the hybrid virus that they helped develop at UNC with Fort Detrick support back in 2015. Dr. Shi knows this because she helped to build it. Now, what does gain of function mean? Again, as I mentioned, gain of function is basically that it made it more potent, it made it more virulent, it made it more deadly, it made it more resistant, it made it more effective, and made it into a super bug that nobody has basically seen before. That's what that means, okay? And it's also remember that this good doctor and her team inserted HIV and MERS proteins into the coronavirus to give it just a touch more kick. This is part of what they did with the coronavirus. So you're taking HIV and MERS, both causes of a lot of disease, a lot of death, a lot of mayhem, and they inserted proteins from HIV and MERS into the coronavirus. So they took proteins from one pathogen that caused one disease, another pathogen caused another disease, and they put both of those into this hybrid virus that is now known as COVID-19. And we'll talk about the specific things that you can do, but there's a lot of misinformation about what people can do to prevent the incidence of COVID-19 or coronavirus in themselves. And this misinformation is actually completely opposite to the truth. And so the things that could protect you, that could help you, and that will actually protect you based upon the research that's already been done, there are actually people out there saying, don't do that because it's going to make you more susceptible, which is absolutely categorically a lie. It's the opposite that you should be doing, that you should be aware of. And these are not drugs. So these are naturally occurring substances. You can just go and get some of this. And we'll talk more about this as we get through this video series. Now, in this article, this was published in 2015. They talk about the new SARS-like virus can jump directly from bats to humans, no treatment available. Now, this is 2015. This is 5-year-old information. And this was from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where Dr. She had been working. All right. This virus is highly pathogenic, and treatments developed against the original SARS virus in 2002 and the ZMapp drugs used to fight Ebola failed to neutralize and control this particular virus. So building resources rather than limiting them to both examine animal populations for new threats and develop therapeutics is key for limiting future outbreaks. So they were already concerned about the potential for outbreaks. In fact, they talked about in this particular one with the SARS, they were talking about how the outbreak was controlled through public health interventions, and the original virus was thought to have been extinct since 2004. But now, what do? They take this virus that we haven't seen since this outbreak in 2002, 2003, and they start messing with it. They start playing with it. They start inserting proteins that they get from HIV and MERS, and they put them into this coronavirus that we thought had actually disappeared and make it more virulent. It makes it into a Superman version of this virus. And there is no known treatment against it, and there's going to be no vaccination that's going to be effective against it. But again, let's hold off. Let's not panic, because what I want to show here is how it was the scientific community that knew about this, and yet they're sitting here making stuff. Why are they making this? And why are they doing gain of function? Why is University of North Carolina involved with this? Why are we funding? Why is the U.S. government funding this research on something that we thought had already disappeared? Why are they trying to get gain of function? Now, some people would say, well, they were just experimenting, they were doing whatever, but they were actual other scientists that opposed this information. They did not want these studies to be done because they were afraid of a breakout. They were afraid of what the ramification would be if there was an outbreak, if the virus was not contained. So this was not something that was obscure. There were some very well-known people that were against this. All right. Okay. Now, there's a lot of people talking about the coronavirus misinformation and then saying it's misinformation, it's controversial, it's conspiracy theory, but they're not really looking at the science. So I want to first, after having built the case, what I just did, I want to show you the actual study that was done. Okay, now, this was published in 2015, November 12th, 2015. And this is actually the full article, the full research paper that was done. But what I want to do is I want to bring your attention to this March 2020 note that has been put there by the editors. And I want to read that first, then I'm going to go through the study, and then I want you to decide what this really means. So the editor's note before we start says, we are aware that this story is being used as a basis of unverified theories that the novel coronavirus causing COVID-19 was engineered. There is no evidence that this is true. Scientists believe that an animal is the most likely source of the coronavirus. Now, it's obviously whoever wrote this from the editor's note perspective was either an idiot or doesn't understand the English language, but certainly wasn't a scientist, because I'm going to now show you what the study says. Remember, this is a warning now that they're putting here to dissuade people, to prevent them from actually looking at the science, to tell you that, look, just because you see it and it's blue, it doesn't mean it's blue. The sky is not blue. Yeah, it looks blue to you, but it's not really blue. Don't believe it. It's not blue. It's actually yellow, but it's not blue. Whatever you see and you think it's blue, it's not blue. So what am I talking about? You see for yourself. In November of 2015, an experiment that created a hybrid version of a bat coronavirus, one related to the virus that caused SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, as we discussed before, has triggered renewed debate over whether engineering lab variants of viruses with possible pandemic potential is worth the risk. This is the lead component, the first paragraph of the study that was published in Nature, probably one of the most respected journals in the world. The first paragraph. Again, I'm going to read this so that you can understand. Take this for the words that I'm saying. I'm not embellishing anything. I'm not exaggerating anything. This is the very first paragraph. An experiment that created a hybrid version of a bat coronavirus, one related to the virus that caused SARS, has triggered renewed debate over whether engineered lab variants of viruses with possible pandemic potential is worth the risk. Okay, this is where we start. Now it goes on, starts talking about the same thing we talked about earlier, the SCH014 version. But I'm just going to focus in on the parts that are highlighted, because I've read these things like half a dozen times now and decided to highlight them so that when I'm doing this video, it's easy for me to focus in on the important parts. So although almost all coronaviruses isolated from bats have not been able to bind to the key human receptor, which is this SHC014, which is the specific coronavirus we're talking about, was able to bind to human protein, was able to get into the human vector, but it's not the first one that could do so. In 2013, researchers actually reported this ability for the first time in a different coronavirus isolated from the same bat population. So as far back as 2013, 7 years ago, we knew that there were certain viruses from bats, that certain strains that consisted of this SCH014 as well as other strains that could actually go from the bat vector to the human vector. Now, creation of a chimeria. What is that? Well, let's look at, I'm just going to go in so that you can understand what the definition of chimeria is. So something that's chimeric, okay? It's of a mythical animal formed from parts of various animals. That's what chimeric means. This is looking at the definition on a search engine. All right. It's also hoped for, built, illusory, or impossible to achieve. From a biological standpoint, the definition of chimeric is relating to or denoting an organism containing a mixture of genetically different tissues formed by processes such as fusion of early embryos, grafting, or mutation. So this is actually taking something, chimeria or chimeric means to adulterate, transform, adjust, change through early fusion of embryos, grafting, mutation, whatever it takes to change the morphological characteristic of whatever the substance or organism is as it appears naturally. All right, so that's what chimeria means, or chimeric means. Creation of a chimeria means creation of a mutation. That's what they're saying. So again, this is the study. All right. I want you to keep on thinking back to what these idiots said. We're aware that the story is being used as a basis for unverified theories. There's no evidence that this is true. The scientists believe that an animal is the most likely source of coronavirus. Okay. Well, we're reading exactly what the study says. This is what you see, reading the blue, and they're saying whatever you see, it's not blue. All right. So, creation of a chimeria. The latest study was already underway before the U.S. moratorium began, and this is a moratorium that the government imposed, a moratorium on federal funding of such research that would ease the spread or host range of dangerous pathogens. So basically, the government in 2014 said, okay, we're not going to fund any research that is related to creating, adulterating, changing a pathogen to make it more dangerous. We're not going to do any more funding for chimeric reasons to create chimeria. We're not going to do that. We're not going to create any more mutants grafted, changing genetically, but using different tissues to form a new mythical animal. We're not going to do that anymore. That's what the government said in 2014, and they put a moratorium on it. However, the moratorium was already began. The U.S. National Institute of Health, and that's going to become important. Who runs the U.S. National Institute of Health? We're going to talk about that. Some obscure person named Anthony Fauci, I think is how you pronounce it, Fauci, and I'm going to show his information in a second. The U.S. National Institute of Health allowed it to proceed while it was underway by the agency, says Ralph Barrick, an infectious disease researcher at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And he was a co-author of the study. The NIH eventually concluded that the work was not so risky as to fall under the moratorium, he says. Now, this is something the government decided they weren't going to do. And now, under the auspices of the director of the National Institute of Health, who's been there, by the way, for 30 years, and we're going to talk about him in just in a moment, this mutation of this virus, the study in 2015 was allowed to occur. All right. Now, Wayne Hobson, a very respected virologist, he disapproved of the study because he said it provided little benefit and reveals little about the risks that the wild SHC014 virus in bats poses to humans. Other experiments in the study show that the virus in the wild bats would need to evolve to pose any threat to humans. Okay, it would need to evolve. It would need to change. It would take time. A change that may never happen, although it cannot be ruled out. Barrick and his team reconstructed the wild virus, the naturally occurring form of the virus, from its genome sequence and found that it grew poorly in human cell cultures and caused no significant disease in mice. Okay, so here you're looking at a virus. It's found in bats. It's very difficult for it to jump to humans. Once in a human, in human cell cultures, it just grew very poorly. And in the mouse model, it didn't cause any significant disease. All right. The only impact of this work is the creation in a lab of a new non-natural risk, agreed Richard Albright, a molecular biologist and biodefense expert at Rutgers University in Piscataway, New Jersey. Both Albright and Wayne Hobson are long-standing critics of gain-of-function research. What is gain-of-function? It is taking something, using the chimeric process to adulterate, change, make a bug into a super bug. Gain-of-function meaning increasing the virulence of a pathogen. So, Albright and Wayne Hobson, long-standing critics of gain-of-function research. Why would you take any kind of organism and make it more potent? Why would you take a bug, a virus, a bacteria, and make it more potent? Right? What's the purpose of that? Well, they say it's for research purposes. But why would you do research to make something more potent? Why wouldn't you do research to make something that's not that bad anyway, less damaging, but they're making it more potent? They're doing gain-of-function studies. This is a gain-of-function study on COVID-19. This is what created it. This is a gain-of-function study that was done on a specific strain of coronavirus called the SHC014 strain. They then did a furin-like cleavage site, which was absent. They created this cleavage site. They added proteins for MERS and HIV. They did all sorts of stuff. I'm not a virologist. So I don't know all the stuff they did, but I can tell you they did a hell of a lot of stuff that they shouldn't have been doing to this virus, to this particular strain of virus that's called the SHC014 coronavirus. And then they made it into something that should have never been created. Okay? They created a chimeria, a mutant form of this coronavirus, which is known as COVID-19. In their paper, the study authors also concede that funders may think twice about allowing such experiments in the future. Scientific review panels may deem similar studies building chimeric viruses based on circulating strains too risky to pursue, adding that discussion is needed as to whether these types of chimeric virus studies warrant further investigation versus the inherent risks involved. So this is what the people that did the research, that published this from the University of North Carolina in 2015 said about a specific form of coronavirus. They basically created this chimeria. They went through the chimeric process to adjust it and get a gain of function to make it more damaging, more virulent. Now, again, I've just read the study to you. Again, we are aware that the story is being used as a basis of unverified theories that the novel coronavirus causing COVID-19 was engineered. There is no evidence that this is true. Seriously? You're looking at the damn study right now. Scientists believe that an animal is the most likely source of the coronavirus. No. Ignore what you've read. Ignore the science. Ignore the research. Ignore some publications. Ignore the history and just to say this is what happened. Now remember, NIH approved this. It was this moratorium that the U.S. government had passed in 2014, but under the auspices of the U.S. National Institute of Health, it was allowed to proceed. All right? We're going to talk about the NIH and who allowed it to proceed. Studies testing hybrid viruses in human cell cultures and animal models are limited in what they can say about the threat posed by a wild virus. So when you're studying this stuff, we should be studying the virus as it occurs in nature, not by humans, by mankind, making them more virulent by making a superbug out of it. Remember H1N1? Okay, there was a patent filed by Baxter in Austria 9 months before the first documented case of H1N1. This type of stuff has been going on. They've been taking viruses and bacteria and doing weird things to them and making superbugs. Why? For research purposes? Well, right here. Scientific review panels may deem similar studies building chimeric viruses based on circulating strains too risky to pursue. Yeah, no shit. It's just amazing to me that this has been happening. Studies testing hybrid viruses in human cell cultures and animal models are limited in what they can say about the threat posed by a wild virus. Dechamps agrees, but he argues that they can help indicate which pathogens should be prioritized for further research attention. Now, that's the most absurd statement, because they're saying, okay, it should be limited, but you know what? It can help us to prioritize further research. So we need to make these superbugs so then we can then warrant our research to go and look at these superbugs and how they affect the human system. How about doing something even a little bit more effective and not create the damn superbug in the first place? Like, you really need to create a superbug and then try to see how it should be prioritized, so they can help indicate which pathogens should be prioritized for further research? I mean, that's the most absurd thing to say. We're going to take a bunch of different viruses and then we're going to see which ones we can create the most potent chimeric changes to. And then once we create this chimera, then we'll go ahead and it'll warrant our priority to which virus we should really work on and focus in on. Well, don't create these super bugs in the first damn place and you won't have to worry about which one you need to prioritize. It gets a little bit more obscure here. I want to now talk about Anthony Fauci. Okay. This is an episode from a podcast. Terry Michaels actually did this particular podcast. And this is a little history about Anthony Fauci. As director of the U.S. National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, Dr. Anthony Fauci controls the direction of AIDS research. By the way, this was in 2014. We're going to come back to him in a second, but this is from the same Nature magazine that the journal that I showed you. But basically, Robert Kennedy had posted this, and he and I talked about this a couple times in the last few days. But basically, again, as I said before, it grows remarkably well in human cultures. This is Simon Wayne Hobson, a virologist at the Pasteur Institute. He points out that the researchers have created a novel virus that grows remarkably well in human cultures. Remember, the original wild type doesn't do well in human cultures. If the virus escaped, nobody could predict the trajectory, he says. And this was back in 2015, 12th November 2015, same journal. And this goes on to talk a little bit more about the COVID-19. Now, it's interesting that Bobby Kennedy said that there were 3 countries that are naturally hostile to each other, which is China, Taiwan, and Japan. And all 3 of them independently concluded that COVID-19 originated in the United States. How could a virus endemic to Chinese bats spread from America? Well, that's what we just covered, right? The 2015 article in Nature raises the possibility that NIH-funded scientists creating the coronavirus pandemic. Yes, they did. I just showed you the evidence of that. The Dr. Shi studied at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She was part of the team. And most of the people that wrote that study were also from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, but there were also people from Harvard and from Switzerland involved with that. We just went over that, right? Now it goes on to talk about the creation of a chimera, which I just showed you. And now let's talk a little bit about Anthony Fauci. All right. Media darling Anthony Fauci, who funded the risky lab experiment to create the novel coronavirus from Chinese bats, now spins the official narrative that the pandemic began in China. Well, China, Taiwan, and Japan, all 3 countries that are hostile to each other, they have already said that this started in the United States, and they're right. It did. All right. Now, Trump reportedly growing frustrated with Dr. Fauci's blunt approach. I wonder why. Because Trump knows certain things. He knows what's happening here. Based upon, you can see his cavalier approach, and we've talked about that before on the Instagram, Facebook posts. But essentially, he's the one who's out there saying, whipping up the story about the China bats, blah, blah, blah. Yet he's the person who did all the HIV studies. Remember that? He's the one who funded them and talked about the viral causation of HIV 3 years before anybody even saw the virus. And there's some contention whether anybody's ever seen the HIV virus in the first place. But he pushed for the drugs. He's been at the NIH for 36 years. He was the one who allowed the chimeric studies to be done on the coronavirus in 2014, even when the moratorium by the government was no more research on creating superbugs. He allowed it to continue, and then he funded it they supplied the virus from Fort Detrick. He funded it. The government in the United States and China funded it. And then this Dr. Shi went back to Wuhan. And then, of course, it got released, or there was an outbreak in Wuhan But where did it all start? It started here in the United States, in North Carolina. So he's often asked, Dr. Fauci has become a household name during the coronavirus outbreak, frequently appearing on TV as a trusted expert on diseases. Yeah, a trusted expert who created the damn thing in the first place, who funded it, who pushed it, who went against a moratorium that the government had passed in 2014. Often tasked with setting the record straight on facts misconstrued or misrepresented by President Donald Trump, Fauci has been left in awkward positions in White House briefings. Really? So now we're going to blame President Donald Trump for misconstrued or misrepresented facts when it's Fauci who's lying to the public and has created more mayhem than any person on the planet? I mean, he's shut down the entire governmental communication between different countries and shut down the economies, crashed the markets, caused 9,000, actually 16,000 deaths now, all because of him pushing for the research and allowing the research to go, even though the government said no more research in that area. Somebody needs to. A New York Times reporter Monday said that Trump has become frustrated with Dr. Fauci. Of course, if I was a commander-in-chief, I would be frustrated with him too. I would have strung him up already. With Fauci's blunt approach at the briefing lecterns, which often contradicts things that the president has just said, according to two people familiar with the dynamic. Fauci also made headlines on Sunday when he said in an interview with Science magazine, "I can't jump in front of the microphone and push him down." Yeah, I think Trump knows what's going on. And if Trump doesn't know what's going on with Fauci, he will know soon. The point, again, is that Fauci is a criminal. And he has been responsible for perpetrating crimes against mankind. You talk about Hitler? Okay, well, now let's talk a little bit about the last portion of this. We talk about some of the continuing misinformation out there. So here's something that was posted today, just a couple hours ago, from a TV station, I believe KSAT. Breaking news, first COVID-19 related death reported in San Antonio. Now, the reason this is kind of important to me personally is because I did my general surgery residency. I was an intern at Brooke Army Medical Center. I spent a lot of time there as a fourth year medical student. And then, of course, I did my internship in general surgery, my first year postgraduate training after internship. After I went to Korea, when I came back, I did my general surgery residency, began that at Brooke Army Medical Center. So a woman in her 80s died at Brooke Army Medical Center on Saturday, officials announced. Okay. This was just posted. I just saw this today, actually Monday, which is, it's not Tuesday morning, but I saw it Monday. Now, they're reporting it as a first COVID-19 related death reported in San Antonio. Now, here's the kicker. This is the family member, Ashley Zara Farrell, off that person. It says KSAT 12 and KSAT.com. I must say I'm highly disappointed at your lack of facts. My grandmother did not pass away at a San Antonio MMC. She passed away at a local inpatient hospice facility. Remember, hospice is for people that are terminal, that are going to die. She did not pass away from COVID-19. She passed away from Alzheimer's, and that she had suffered from for the past 12 years, and a case of aspiration pneumonia that worsened her ailing state. Shame on you, KSAT. Again, the media is hyping this crap and scaring people. They're not reporting the facts. They're not reporting the truth. They're lying. This was information from last Monday, so it's a week ago, and the numbers have gone up. This death is supposedly now 16,000 worldwide. Recoveries over 101,000. Total cases around 300 and some thousand. But the information is that right now in Wuhan, reports of no new cases for the last 5 straight days, and they're actually talking about life coming back to normal. Checkpoints are being removed. Health workers disinfecting subway cars and stations, and leaders met Monday to discuss scheduling the resumption of work and production. So this is interesting. Monday marks 2 months since Chinese authorities placed Wuhan on lockdown as the virus spread like wildfire throughout the city and greater Hubei province. Last thing I want to talk about is a little bit about politics here. Senator Rand Paul, who's a doctor, by the way, they said that he was reckless. Again, the media is reporting he's reckless. His actions on coronavirus, he apparently got exposed to coronavirus, and they're saying that, you know, even though he's got coronavirus, he's still meeting with other people. He's working out in the gym, and that's not responsible, blah, blah, blah. Again, they're trying to, make him look bad, but this is what Senator Paul had said. I met his father, Congressman Ron Paul, just recently, and had a nice 5-6 minute conversation, actually closer, 10-minute conversation with him in Mexico at an Acapulco conference where I gave a lecture. And Senator Rand Paul was quoted to say, "We absolutely must resist government-run amok taking advantage of a crisis. This is how your liberty dies. Stand up, America, and resist. Department of Justice seeks new emergency powers amid coronavirus pandemic." This is the issue. This is what we need to be afraid of, that they're going to use this false flag type of event, hype it up to take away more rights, more freedoms, and create mandatory actions that people have to do, from quarantine to even more sinister things that are coming down the pipeline. So you need to be aware of this stuff. You need to be aware of the agenda. All right. We're going to talk about the next video. We're going to talk about even worse things that are coming down the pipeline, even other things that you don't know that have made this coronavirus even more damaging. And we're going to talk about that in more detail. This is a post that I put up a few days ago. I want you to remember that this is not the first time this has happened. This was Lyme's disease in the 1990s, SARS in 2002, XMRV in 2009, MERS in 2012, Ebola in 2014, and Zika in 2016, and actually H1N1 in 2010. That's when I put out some videos that had an impact on letting people know really what was going on. If you remember, Obama predicted that there were going to be 60 million Americans that were going to die. 20% of the U.S. population was going to die because of H1N1. But I put out a couple of videos, and according to at least one person, David Wilcock from the History Channel, that those videos made a difference. And according to him, at a conference that I was at, once he recognized me, said that I was responsible for saving 1 billion lives. I didn't know what he was talking about, and then he referred to the video. And actually, it's about getting the information out so people realize and recognize what's going on. And however it happens, whoever passes it on, I really don't care who gets credit for anything. I just want people to know that the agenda is highly, highly suspect. Be aware. Don't be paralyzed by fear, because this is part and parcel of their agenda. All right. There's 7 toxicities according to my philosophy, and they have hit 6 of the 7 toxicities. The 5th toxicity being emotional, psychological. That's what they've done with this hype, by creating the hype, by creating the fear mongering. That is affecting people on an emotional, psychological level. All right. The virus is a self-limiting virus. It seems to burn through. If your immune system is intact, it's not going to affect you. And if it does, it's going to be very, very transient. 24, 48 hours, most people get better. The last thing I want to show you, the email that I got about 8 o'clock in the evening from the North Carolina Medical Board for all doctors in North Carolina. And I just want you to see, this is a North Carolina Medical Board is sending you this March 23rd, 2020 public health alert at the request of the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. The following message is from the state epidemiologist, Dr. Zach Moore. All right. So let's see what Dr. Moore has to say. And you can see the time of this email. Well, here we go. It was 8:05 p.m. last night, right before I went live on the live stream, public live stream that I do every Monday night. So it goes through a bunch of stuff over here. Please read the updated guidance and documents. There are 4 bullets. Only the first one is highlighted. Changes in testing recommendation. People with mild symptoms consistent with COVID-19 do not, capital not, do not need testing and should be instructed to stay at home to recover. Why don't they need testing? Because the tests are riddled with false positives. And rather than tell people that, well, you may or may not have it, they're just going to say, don't even test it. You have it. We know you have it. Just stay at home. Again, furthering the hysteria. So even the testing now, they're not recommending it. All right. This is the last thing I want to show you now. I want you to watch an interview with a doctor that was the first doctor to diagnose the case in Washington State. But I want to have you watch the interview that they did with a person that was on the ship, on the cruise line that was quarantined, and hear it from the individual themselves that were quarantined, that were tested positive, and their course of disease, of what they suffered when they went through a COVID-19 coronavirus infection. All right, you can hear it yourself.
older and already immune compromised individuals or with people with really serious underlying health conditions. Is this a lot worse than, say, a really bad infection of influenza?
That's a very good question. I don't think we really know the science behind why folks that are older or have medical illnesses are more at risk for severe disease. We do know that when they become infected, many of them end up in the hospital in ICUs, and the mortality seems to be quite high in that patient population. That's probably what we're seeing, at least locally, probably worse than what we usually see with seasonal flu in the same population. Why that is, I don't think we really understand quite yet.
Based on this case you've treated, and obviously Washington State's hit the hardest, and you all have been talking amongst yourselves and other docs there in the area, is you can call it what you want, but the fear, the panic, the freak out that exists among the normal, healthy U.S. population about this, is people are talking about stockpiling toilet paper and everything else. Is that justified, or does there seem to be an overreaction from what we know medically perhaps is justified?
Well, one of the first things I want to discuss is the protective gear that people are buying. Right now, there I think are folks that are buying a lot of masks. The CDC has been very clear that the average person walking in the streets is very low risk in general, and that it's not advised to buy masks, surgical masks, out and about.
Yeah, we heard from the Surgeon General that buying the masks actually keep them away from the people that need them the most, perhaps doctors and health officials like yourself. We had someone who was a survivor of the coronavirus. She got it on one of the cruise ships on yesterday. Taking a listen to her experience.
I had about a 3-hour fever of not even 100 degrees the night before, and that was it. I have not had one symptom, since then.
Wait, so even while you had the virus, like at its peak, you're saying you still didn't really experience symptoms?
Zero symptoms.
Wow.
None.
That was Jerry, who said she did Pilates and yoga throughout her quarantine and while she had the virus. Is it important to also talk about, in addition to those who have died, the people who experienced something akin to the common cold with this?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Most folks that are infected with this virus will have mild disease, won't need to come into the hospital, won't have to be admitted. And so what we're working on at Providence is triaging those groups of folks so that we're keeping a close eye on these people that present through the ED for testing to make sure that we keep track of them. We're plugging them into our telehealth program so that we can monitor their oxygen levels at home and other vital signs at home to make sure that they don't have a decline. And this includes folks that are over the age of 60 or have other medical problems that put them at higher risk for severe disease. Those people that are low risk, there's really not much at this point that needs to be done for them in terms of just simple monitoring at home and staying home while they're ill. Yeah. So there is a distinction that we're making in terms of risk assessment for those that are high risk for severe disease.
So there you have it. That's the evidence of the scientific corruption that I talked about. It's been published. It's even been warned against, that the publications that you're seeing, that the sky's blue, that's what they tell you, but that whatever you're looking at, it's not blue. It's that absurd. This was orchestrated, planned by somebody who started the AIDS component 3 years before the first virus was ever even known to exist. Regardless, in 1981, he pushed the agenda, Fauci pushed the agenda to start the drugs, had a conflict of interest on these particular drugs by promoting it to men that were homosexual, and encouraged them to prophylactically use these drugs that were very, very toxic and also had really no, if anything, just had a placebo effect. And then orchestrated this beyond the government's restrictions and the moratorium to do chimeric research on pathogens that had a particular propensity to become pathogenic, so to allow the research to be done for gain of function. There was a moratorium on it. He allowed it to bypass that moratorium with this coronavirus, allowed the creation of the COVID-19, helped to fund it with American taxpayer dollars, and now is standing up there saying that China was the one responsible for it. Yet we have the scientific evidence published in Nature magazine from 2015 showing that the research was done, the gain of function components were done by the scientists in North Carolina that then went back to Wuhan, learned all the techniques, went back to Wuhan, created whatever was being created. But it was discussed in 2015 that this should not be done. it's like the smoking gun that shows that this should not be done. There were two main scientists that said this should not be done. There have been many scientists that have been against the gain of function component for the chimeric testing of not just coronavirus, but for many other types of pathogens, and we don't know what else they're creating. I know this was a long video. I hope you understand the significance of this. Pay it forward, pass it on, let people know the truth. The next video that's coming, which will be released in the next 48 hours, will talk about the next component that takes this issue and exacerbates it and magnifies it, makes it even worse. And then we're probably going to have one more video after that so that you guys understand what you can do, how you can help your families prevent anything from happening. But hopefully you're already recognizing that the coronavirus isn't what it's made out to be. And I'm also going to call out some of the doctors out there that are putting out misinformation. And some have said, well, they probably don't know. Well, then if they don't know, they should shut their mouth and not talk about stuff that they don't know. So I hope that this information was informative. The next video, part 4, will be released in 48 hours.